Man killed by his best friend returns with a terrifying message from hell. The air was thick with tension as Mark stumbled through the alley, his pulse pounding in his ears, his legs heavy with exhaustion. The streetlights above flickered erratically, casting long, menacing shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally in the darkness. He had run for what felt like hours, but his mind was still clouded by the fear, the confusion. The truth had been revealed to him only moments ago, but it felt as though the world had been shattered in an instant. He couldn't think straight, couldn't grasp the enormity of what had happened. His best friend, Jason, his lifelong companion, the one person he had trusted above all others, had betrayed him. And it wasn't just a simple betrayal. Jason had killed him. The knife had been so sudden, so unexpected. Mark hadn't even seen it coming. One moment, they were talking, the usual back and forth, joking about old times, and the next, the pain had exploded in his chest as the blade buried itself deep into his heart. The world had blurred in that moment, and Mark had felt his legs give out beneath him as the darkness consumed him. But it hadn't been the end, not really. Something had happened. He didn't know how, he didn't know why, but he was here now, walking through the alley as if nothing had ever happened. But everything had changed. The weight in his chest, the tightness in his throat, told him something wasn't right. He had died, and he was no longer in the world he had known. Mark didn't know where he was, but he could feel it. Something terrible had happened. He had come back for a reason, and he didn't understand it yet, but the message was already starting to reveal itself. As he rounded the corner, Mark's breath caught in his throat. He was no longer in an alley. The surroundings were different, too different. The streets were barren, empty. The buildings loomed above him, their windows black and broken. The air was thick with an oppressive heaviness that seemed to weigh down on him from all sides. He looked around, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was no one in sight. The silence was deafening. It was as if he had stepped into a world where time had stopped. There was no movement, no life, just an overwhelming sense of doom hanging in the air. "Where am I?" Mark muttered to himself, his voice sounding distant, like it didn't even belong to him. He didn't understand. This wasn't the world he knew. This was something else. As he stumbled forward, trying to make sense of the strange world around him, Mark could feel it. Something was watching him. He wasn't alone. The air seemed to hum with a dark energy, and his skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being observed by something beyond the physical. He wasn't sure how, but he could feel eyes on him. No, not just eyes. He could feel the very essence of something malevolent, something far darker than he had ever experienced. Mark turned his head sharply, scanning the empty streets. A shadow moved in the corner of his eye, and he froze. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His breath hitched in his throat as the shadow grew, slithering toward him like a creature of the dark. It was fast, too fast, and before Mark could react, the shadow was upon him. The air around him grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Mark's breath turned to fog in the freezing air. He felt a pressure on his chest, as though the very darkness was closing in, squeezing the life out of him. The sensation was suffocating, and Mark gasped for breath, his lungs burning with the cold. He tried to back away, but the darkness was everywhere now, surrounding him, pressing him into the ground. Suddenly, a voice, deep, guttural, and laced with malice, boomed from the darkness, freezing Mark in his tracks. "Your punishment has just begun, Mark." Mark's blood ran cold as he whipped around, searching for the source of the voice. There was nothing but shadows, no figure, no face. Just a void, as if the very space around him had become alive with an evil force. He staggered back, feeling the darkness closing in on him from all sides. He wanted to run, to escape, but there was no way out. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and he stumbled, falling to his knees. "Who are you?" Mark gasped, his voice barely audible over the growing hum of the darkness. "What do you want from me?" The voice responded, its tone mocking and cruel. "You should know better, Mark. You've already been judged." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He had been dead. He had felt his life slip away, felt his body go cold, and yet he was still here, still breathing, still alive? Not alive. Not in the way he had been before. "No," Mark whispered to himself, shaking his head. "No, I don't deserve this. I didn't do anything wrong." The voice laughed, the sound harsh and unforgiving. "You're wrong, Mark. You think you're innocent? You think Jason didn't deserve it? He was a man who betrayed you, and you, who killed him first?" Mark's eyes widened. The voice had hit him with a revelation that made his heart stop. Betrayal? Jason? Mark had trusted Jason. He had considered him a brother, a friend. But as the voice continued, a flood of memories surged to the surface, memories he had buried deep down. Jason hadn't just killed him. Jason had been the final strike. The last in a long line of betrayals that had begun long before the fateful night in the alley. Mark felt the weight of the truth crash into him. Jason wasn't the first to betray him. The realization twisted his stomach in knots, and the world around him seemed to close in on him. His body trembled, not from fear, but from the crushing weight of understanding. The darkness seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy, and Mark couldn't escape. He was no longer in control. The truth, the horrors of his past, everything he had ignored, it was all coming to a head. "Jason didn't kill you," the voice whispered, its tone cold and final. "You killed yourself long before he did. And now, you will face the consequences." The void seemed to pulse with laughter, the shadows around him deepening. And in that moment, Mark knew he was trapped. There was no escape. He had crossed the point of no return. The chill in the air grew colder still, as the darkness enveloped him completely. Mark closed his eyes, feeling his breath catch in his throat, as the world around him faded into an endless void. What he had thought was a second chance, what he had hoped would be his redemption, had only been the beginning of something far worse. Mark's chest heaved as the oppressive darkness surrounded him, pressing against his skin like a suffocating weight. His mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic mess of fear, confusion, and denial. The voice's words echoed in his head, cruel and unrelenting. "You killed yourself long before he did?" What did that even mean? How could Jason not be responsible? The blade, the alley, it had all been Jason's doing. Mark had seen the betrayal in his friend's eyes, felt the sting of the knife as it pierced his chest. Jason had killed him. And yet, the voice had spoken with such certainty, such authority, that Mark couldn't help but question everything he thought he knew. The darkness pulsed around him, alive with an energy that felt ancient and malevolent. Shadows twisted and writhed at the edges of his vision, forming shapes that disappeared as soon as he tried to focus on them. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him, judging him, their presence making the air heavy and cold. Mark stumbled to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady. "I don't understand," he shouted into the void, his voice echoing into the emptiness. "What are you talking about? I didn't do anything." The voice didn't respond, but the air around him seemed to shift, growing colder, sharper. It wasn't the silence of indifference, it was the silence of anticipation, as though the darkness itself was waiting for something. Mark's breath came in short, shallow gasps, his chest tightening with the suffocating pressure of the void. And then, without warning, the shadows around him began to move. They swirled and twisted, coalescing into shapes that made his stomach churn. Faces appeared in the darkness, their features distorted and grotesque, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They stared at him with a mix of hatred and sorrow, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. Mark took a step back, his heart racing. What are you?" he stammered, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The faces didn't respond. They simply watched him, their hollow gazes unblinking. But as Mark stared back at them, something shifted. He began to recognize them, not their faces, but their presence. Each one carried a weight, a familiarity that he couldn't ignore. Memories flooded his mind, unbidden and overwhelming. He saw flashes of moments he had tried to forget, moments he had buried deep within himself. Arguments with friends, cold shoulders to loved ones, decisions made out of anger or pride. Each face in the darkness was tied to a memory, a person he had wronged, hurt, or abandoned. "No," Mark whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the faces didn't fade. They only grew clearer, their expressions more accusatory. And then one of them spoke. "You left me," the voice said, soft but filled with pain. "You knew I needed you, and you left anyway." Mark's stomach twisted as he recognized the voice. It belonged to his sister, Emily. He hadn't seen her face in years, not since the fight that had torn their family apart. She had begged him to stay, to help her, but he had walked away, consumed by his own anger and frustration. He had convinced himself that she didn't need him, that she would be fine without him. But she hadn't been fine. Mark's knees buckled and he sank to the ground, his hands trembling. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to?" Another voice interrupted, this one harsher, angrier. "You didn't mean to abandon us? To betray us?" The shadows shifted again, and Mark saw another face emerge from the darkness. It was his childhood friend, Aaron, the boy he had grown up with, the one who had been like a brother to him. Aaron had trusted Mark, had confided in him during his darkest moments. But when Aaron needed him most, Mark had turned his back, too consumed by his own problems to offer the support his friend had desperately needed. "I trusted you, Mark," Aaron said, his voice laced with bitterness. "And you let me down. You let all of us down." Mark's chest tightened as the weight of their words crushed him. He had spent so long running from his mistakes, convincing himself that they didn't matter, that the past was behind him. But now, faced with the specters of his guilt, he couldn't deny the truth any longer. He had hurt people. He had failed them. "I didn't mean to," Mark said again, his voice breaking. "I was scared. I didn't know how to help." The shadows swirled, their faces blending together into a dark, chaotic mass. The air grew colder still, the weight of their judgment pressing down on Mark like a physical force. "You didn't know how to help," the voice from the void repeated, mocking him. "Is that your excuse, Mark? Is that what you'll tell yourself when the time comes to face the truth?" Mark shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know. I didn't know what to do." The voice laughed, the sound hollow and cruel. "Ignorance is no excuse. You made your choices, Mark. And now, you must face the consequences." The ground beneath Mark began to shift, cracks forming in the void as the darkness pulsed with an ominous energy. The faces around him twisted and distorted, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their silent accusations piercing his soul. He wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness was everywhere, consuming everything. "Please," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, just tell me what to do. Tell me how to fix this." The voice didn't respond. The darkness grew deeper, the air colder, until Mark could barely breathe. He felt the weight of his guilt pressing down on him, suffocating him as the shadows closed in. And then, just as the void threatened to swallow him whole, a faint light appeared in the distance. It was small, barely visible, but it was enough to make the darkness falter. The shadows recoiled, their movements hesitant, as if the light carried a power they couldn't withstand. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the light, its warmth cutting through the cold, oppressive void. He didn't know what it was or where it came from, but he felt a flicker of hope stir within him. The light grew brighter, its glow steady and unwavering. It was a beacon, a lifeline, and Mark knew he had to reach it. But as he took a step toward it, the shadows surged forward, their growls low and menacing. The darkness wasn't going to let him go without a fight. Mark's feet moved on their own as he stumbled toward the light, each step a struggle against the pressure of the darkness around him. The growls from the creatures behind him grew louder, more insistent, their twisted forms now visible in the peripheral vision. They were closing in fast, the weight of their presence so heavy that Mark could almost feel their claws scraping the air behind him. Every instinct screamed at him to run faster, but his legs were like lead, heavy and unresponsive. The light ahead flickered and pulsed, as though it was trying to fight against the overwhelming force of the darkness, but it wasn't strong enough. Not yet. The darkness, the voices, the creatures, they all sought to drag him back into the void, back into the place where his mistakes and guilt had festered and multiplied. The weight of everything he had done was too much for him to bear, and it seemed as though the void itself wanted to crush him for it. Mark's breath came in shallow gasps as he pushed forward, every step feeling like it could be his last. He felt the cold breath of the creatures on the back of his neck, heard their claws scraping against the ground, coming closer with each passing second. He was running out of time. The light seemed so far away now, barely a pinprick in the distance, but he couldn't stop. The guilt, the regret, the crushing weight of his past pushed him onward, the only thing keeping him moving. He didn't know what was waiting for him at the end of this journey, but he knew he couldn't go back. He couldn't let the darkness win. The creatures behind him snarled, their voices a cacophony of anger and hunger. He could feel their malice burning into him, their desire to tear him apart, to drag him down into the pit of his own self-loathing. They were manifestations of everything he had failed to face, everything he had buried deep within himself. And they weren't going to let him forget it. Mark's body screamed in protest as he forced himself to move faster, his legs trembling with the effort, his chest tight with every ragged breath. He could see the light now, growing brighter as he pushed through the thick fog of darkness. It was so close, but he knew that the creatures were closing in too. The chase wasn't over. Not yet. Just as the shadows reached out for him, Mark took one final, desperate step forward, and the light enveloped him. He felt it wash over him like a wave, a warmth so intense it burned his skin, but it wasn't painful. It was the kind of warmth that made him feel whole again, made him feel like he wasn't alone. For a brief moment, he felt a sense of peace, a reprieve from the suffocating terror of the darkness. But as the light surrounded him, he realized something. He wasn't alone in it. There was something else here, something familiar. A presence. Something he couldn't quite place. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned, scanning the glowing space around him. His eyes landed on a figure standing before him. It was a man, dressed in white, his face obscured by a hood. The figure radiated a calm, peaceful energy, but there was something else in his eyes. Something deep. Something that made Mark's heart race in his chest. The figure didn't speak at first. He simply watched Mark, his expression unreadable, as if waiting for something. Mark's throat tightened, and he forced himself to speak. Who are you?" The figure remained silent for a long moment, but then his voice came, soft and resonant. "I am the guide, the one who walks with those who have lost their way." Mark stared at the figure, trying to process the words. "Lost my way," he repeated, his voice hoarse. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The figure's eyes softened, and for the first time, Mark felt a sense of understanding. "You've carried the burden of guilt for too long, Mark. You've run from your past, from your mistakes. But running does not make them go away. It only delays the inevitable." Mark swallowed hard, the weight of the figure's words settling heavily on him. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. The truth of what had happened, of his own role in everything that had gone wrong, was too much for him to deny anymore. "What do I have to do?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "How do I fix this?" The figure stepped closer, his presence calm and steady. "To fix it, you must first face it. The darkness you see is not just the result of what others have done. It is a reflection of what you have done as well. You have hurt those you love, abandoned them, betrayed them. And now you must confront that truth." Mark closed his eyes, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. He had run from it for so long, had buried it so deep inside that he had convinced himself it didn't matter. But now, with the figure's words echoing in his ears, he knew he couldn't run anymore. "You cannot change the past," the figure continued, his voice gentle but firm. "But you can choose how to live in the future. Redemption does not come from erasing your mistakes, Mark. It comes from acknowledging them, learning from them, and using that knowledge to move forward." Mark's chest tightened. The figure was right. He couldn't undo what had been done. He couldn't bring back those he had hurt. He couldn't erase the past. But maybe he could try to be better. Maybe he could start from here and make something of the time he had left. The figure raised his hand, as if to offer a choice, a path forward. "The darkness will try to pull you back, Mark. It will tempt you to retreat into what is familiar. But you must resist it. You must choose to confront it head-on." Mark felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Fear, guilt, but also something else. A flicker of hope. It was small, but it was there. For the first time since his death, he felt a glimmer of something resembling peace. The light ahead of him seemed to grow brighter, as though in response to his resolve. "Are you ready?" the figure asked, his voice quiet but filled with authority. Mark took a deep breath, the weight of his past still pressing down on him, but something within him stirred. He wasn't sure if he was ready, if he could ever truly be ready. But for the first time, he felt like it was possible. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "I'm ready." And with that, the figure nodded, stepping aside to reveal the path before him. The light ahead of him grew brighter, illuminating the way forward. The darkness, still lingering at the edges of his mind, was far from gone, but for the first time, Mark felt that he could face it. And in that moment he knew that this was his chance. To confront his past, to make things right, and to move forward. Mark stepped forward, the light before him growing brighter as though it were pulling him closer, urging him to continue. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he didn't turn back. He had made the decision, and now, there was no going back. The darkness still loomed at the edges of his vision, but the light ahead was his only guide, the only thing that felt real in this place that had once been his afterlife. The air around him seemed to hum with an unseen energy, like the very space he occupied was alive with tension. He felt as though he were walking through a dream, one that was fading, shifting, changing with every step. His surroundings seemed fluid, more surreal than any reality he had ever known. But the overwhelming sense of loss, of fear, was still there, lurking beneath the surface of everything. The figure in white, his guide, had stepped aside to let him pass. The silence between them stretched out like a chasm, and Mark's footsteps echoed in the empty space. There were no words between them now, only the soft hum of energy surrounding him, filling the void with a strange sense of anticipation. Mark wasn't sure where the figure had gone or if he was still watching, but he felt as though his journey was his alone now. His feet carried him further, each step taking him closer to something unknown, but the uncertainty was no longer as terrifying. It had become a part of him, a constant companion, much like the darkness. He couldn't escape it, not fully. But the light ahead was different. It wasn't an escape. It was a promise. A promise that he could face what lay ahead, no matter how painful it might be. Mark's mind swirled with conflicting emotions, but as he walked, the fog of confusion seemed to clear, bit by bit. He could feel the weight of his past lifting, if only just a little. Each step felt like a piece of the puzzle falling into place, and though the journey was far from over, he no longer felt like he was walking aimlessly. He was walking toward something that mattered, toward redemption, toward peace. He could hear the echo of his guide's voice in his mind. "The darkness will try to pull you back." Mark clenched his jaw as if to silence the whisper of fear that threatened to rise within him. He couldn't go back. He had made his choice. He wasn't going to let the darkness swallow him again. The light grew even brighter, nearly blinding now. But instead of blinding him with terror, it was offering him clarity, offering him a chance. The more he moved forward, the clearer the path became, the more he could sense the figure's presence, no longer as an external force, but as something internal. The figure had planted a seed in him, understanding that he couldn't ignore. The path he had chosen was hard, but it was his to walk. But just as the warmth of the light seemed to reach out and welcome him, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath his feet trembled. Mark's heart skipped a beat, and he froze. The tremor, at first subtle, grew stronger with each passing second, and suddenly, the very fabric of the air around him seemed to shake with a violent force. The light flickered. It was as if the world itself was shifting, as though it couldn't decide which direction to take. Mark stumbled forward, his knees buckling as the world seemed to tilt around him. His head swam with dizziness, and he tried to steady himself, gripping the ground with his hands as though holding on to reality itself. His chest tightened in fear, and his heart pounded against his ribcage, louder than ever before. Not yet, a voice suddenly rang out from the darkness, sending a shiver down Mark's spine. He whipped his head around, but there was no figure. Only the ever-expanding darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly behind him. But the voice had come from somewhere near. He could feel its presence, like an invisible weight pressing against him. "What do you want from me?" Mark called out, his voice trembling. "I've made my choice. I'm going forward." The voice laughed, low and chilling, like the rattle of chains dragging across the floor of a prison. "You can't escape it, Mark. You can't run away from what you've done." Mark's breath hitched, and he stumbled backward, nearly losing his footing. The light around him wavered again, flickering as the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, becoming more tangible, more solid. They were coming for him. The creatures from the darkness were closing in, their twisted forms visible just at the edge of his sight, barely perceptible, but undeniably there. "Please," Mark cried, his voice raw with desperation. "I don't want to go back. I don't want to face it again." But there was no escape. He could feel the creatures closing in. The ground beneath him seemed to crumble away, pieces falling into an endless void, just as his fear of what he had done seemed to drag him back to that point. The weight of his past pressed down on him, suffocating him, holding him in place. "No!" Mark shouted again, his hands reaching out as though to stop the darkness from swallowing him whole. "I won't go back. I can't. Not anymore." But the world didn't listen. The shadows grew thicker, the cold air more oppressive. He could hear the creatures, his own guilt, his mistakes, crawling closer, their hunger relentless. They wanted him to fail. They wanted him to give in to the darkness, to become one of them. Mark stood tall, shaking but resolute. He would not go back. He would not let this be his end. The figure had shown him the way forward. The light had been a promise, a chance to make things right. And he wasn't going to let anything pull him away from that path. With one final breath, Mark stepped forward, pushing against the force of the darkness that seemed determined to pull him back into the abyss. The creatures screeched in frustration as he moved toward the light once more, but this time, Mark was ready. He wasn't running anymore. He had made his choice. And nothing, not even the darkness, could take that away from him. Mark's every step felt heavier than the last, each movement a battle against the weight of the darkness that threatened to pull him back. The creatures, the twisted manifestations of his past mistakes and guilt, were relentless. They clawed at the edges of his consciousness, trying to drag him into the abyss. Their screeches echoed through the void, their hunger growing with every step he took away from them. But Mark refused to stop. He had already faced his demons. He had confronted the truth of his own failures, the consequences of his actions, and now he was moving forward. No matter how much the darkness tried to tear him apart, he wouldn't go back. The light ahead was his only hope, and he had made his choice. He had to keep moving. The weight of his guilt still pressed against him, but it was no longer suffocating. It was a reminder, a lesson. He couldn't undo the past, but he could learn from it. He could change, and that was what mattered. The darkness that had once felt like an insurmountable wall now seemed more like a shadow, one that would always be there, but one that he could live with. With every step, the light ahead grew brighter, the warmth radiating through the coldness of the void. Mark felt it now, a sense of clarity that he hadn't known before. The path wasn't easy. It wasn't meant to be. But it was his to walk, and that gave him a strength he hadn't realized he had. The creatures, once so close behind him, had begun to fade, their howls growing more distant. Mark didn't know how much further he had to go, but he knew that he couldn't afford to look back. The past was behind him, and no matter how much it wanted to haunt him, it was his future that mattered now. As he walked, the air around him seemed to change. It was no longer oppressive, no longer thick with the weight of his guilt and regret. It was lighter now, more breathable. The light ahead pulsed with a steady rhythm, a heartbeat that seemed to match his own. It wasn't just a light. It was life. It was the possibility of a new beginning, a chance to start over. Mark didn't know what was waiting for him at the end of this journey, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let fear dictate his path. He couldn't let the past control him anymore. He had to face it, to move through it, and come out the other side stronger. The ground beneath him shifted, and for a moment he thought he had lost his footing. But instead of falling, he felt a sense of stability, as though the world around him was solidifying. The darkness that had once seemed so overwhelming now appeared distant, almost insignificant. It was as if the very space around him had begun to reshape itself, aligning with his resolve. And then, just as Mark thought he was nearing the end of his journey, a figure appeared before him. At first, it was nothing more than a silhouette, a shadow in the distance. But as it drew closer, Mark saw it more clearly. The figure was tall, shrouded in white light, its features obscured by a glowing aura. It was calm, almost serene, but there was a quiet strength to it that Mark couldn't ignore. The figure's eyes locked with his, and Mark felt an immediate connection, as though the figure had known him for a lifetime. It wasn't just a presence, it was something more. It was something ancient, something that transcended the boundaries of the afterlife. And for the first time since his death, Mark felt like he wasn't alone. "You have come far," the figure spoke, its voice soft but resonant, as though each word carried the weight of ages. "But this is only the beginning, Mark." Mark stood frozen, unsure of what to say, unsure of what this figure represented. But he felt a pull, a need to speak, to ask questions that had been gnawing at him since his return. "Who are you?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper, but it felt like it carried across the vastness of the void. The figure smiled, a subtle, knowing smile that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. "I am the guide, the one who leads those who have wandered in darkness." Mark's heart skipped a beat as the figure's words sank in. A guide? Was this the same guide who had helped him face his demons, who had shown him the path forward? Was this the force that had led him away from the suffocating grip of the shadows? "You've seen what lies ahead, Mark," the figure continued. "You've walked through the darkness, but now you must understand it. You must understand why you are here." Mark's throat tightened, the weight of the figure's words pressing against him. "I faced it," he said, his voice stronger now. "I've faced my past. I've accepted my mistakes. But why am I still here?" The figure's gaze softened, and for the first time, Mark saw something akin to compassion in its eyes. "You are here because you have chosen to confront yourself. You have chosen to face the truth, to walk through the darkness rather than run from it. But redemption is not given, it is earned. And the road ahead will be long. You will encounter many trials, but each one will teach you something you must learn." Mark nodded slowly, the weight of the figure's words settling in his chest. He had already taken the first step, but the journey was far from over. He would have to prove himself. He would have to live up to the choices he had made. The path would not be easy, but it would be worth it. The figure stepped aside, gesturing toward the path ahead. "This is where you must go. The light is within reach, but you must earn your place in it." Mark took a deep breath, his heart steadying as he took the first step forward. The light ahead seemed brighter now, more tangible. It wasn't just a distant hope, it was something real, something he could touch. He had made it this far. He had confronted the darkness, but now he had to walk through it. The road ahead was uncertain, but Mark felt ready. For the first time since his death, he felt like he had a purpose. He wasn't running anymore. He was moving forward. With each step, he felt the weight of his past lifting, and though the darkness would always be a part of him, he knew he could live with it. He had made the choice to change. And that, more than anything, was the key to his redemption. Mark's heart pounded as he moved forward. The figure, still standing beside him, remained silent, allowing him to find his pace, his resolve. The path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, bathed in the soft glow of the distant light that beckoned him onward. It wasn't just a symbol of hope anymore. It was a challenge. It was something real, something tangible, and Mark felt every inch of the journey pressing against him with every step. The further he walked, the more he realized how unfamiliar this place truly was. There was no true sense of space, no landmarks to guide him. The void surrounding him was endless, vast, and oppressive. He wasn't sure if this place existed outside of time or if it was simply the manifestation of his own subconscious fears. The air around him felt thick, heavy with uncertainty. It wasn't quite cold, but there was an odd, pervasive chill that gnawed at his skin, at his very being. He could still hear the faint whispers of his past, the distant voices of the people he had hurt, the ones he had failed. Their words were distant now, but still too close, a constant reminder of the darkness he had carried with him for so long. He had thought, upon entering this place, that he might escape them, but it was clear now that he couldn't. His past was always going to be with him, like a shadow that clung to his every move. The figure beside him hadn't spoken for a while, but Mark knew it was there. He could feel the weight of its presence, an ever-watchful guardian, guiding him without saying a word. The silence was comforting in a way, allowing Mark to process everything that had happened, everything he had learned. It gave him space to breathe, to reflect, and yet, the uncertainty of the path ahead never let him rest. He took another step, his boots sinking into the soft ground, and then he felt it. A vibration, faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. The ground beneath his feet trembled. It wasn't an earthquake, but something much deeper. The air itself seemed to shudder, and Mark could hear the faint hum of something vibrating through the atmosphere. It was the sound of something ancient, something alive, something that Mark couldn't begin to understand. The figure beside him turned, its glowing form now casting long shadows in the light, and Mark could see a flicker of something darker, flashing in its eyes. He stepped back, taken aback by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. "What's happening?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His pulse quickened. The vibrations seemed to grow stronger, a deep rumble that resonated in his chest. The figure didn't answer immediately. It just stood there, watching the ground beneath them as if anticipating something. Mark's throat tightened as the hum grew louder. A pressure built in the air, a tangible force pressing in on them. It was suffocating. "You are being tested," the figure said at last, its voice calm but heavy with meaning. "This is the next step in your journey. You must face the darkness, not just the one around you, but the one inside you." Mark's chest tightened at the words. He wasn't sure what the figure meant. He had already faced his past, had confronted the guilt, the mistakes, the pain. But the way the figure spoke made him realize that there was still more to confront, more he had yet to understand. This wasn't just about accepting the past. It was about understanding the depth of the darkness within himself, the darkness that had led him to fail those he loved, the darkness that had blinded him to their pain and suffering. Suddenly, the rumbling stopped. The air grew still, the vibrations fading into silence. Mark looked around, feeling a sudden sense of unease. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath. And then, the silence was shattered. From the depths of the void, a shadow emerged, a shape, tall and looming, its features indistinguishable in the dim light. It moved toward Mark, its presence suffocating, like a wave crashing over him. The figure loomed closer, its form growing more defined with each step it took, its shadow casting an unnatural length against the ground. Mark's heart raced. He felt the darkness closing in on him again, the fear, the guilt, all of it flooding back. This was it. This was the test. He wasn't just running from his past anymore. He had to face it. But how? How could he defeat something that had become so much a part of him? The figure raised its hand, and Mark felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if the figure were about to deliver a judgment, something final, something irreversible. He stood frozen, rooted to the ground, unsure whether he should run or face it head-on. He had already come so far. But was he truly ready to confront the depth of his own darkness? The figure spoke then, its voice a low, gravelly murmur that sent a shiver through Mark's entire being. "You think you can leave this place unscathed?" The voice echoed in the stillness, low and mocking. "You think you can face the darkness and emerge unscathed?" Mark felt a chill of recognition. This voice, it was familiar, wasn't it? His mind raced, trying to place it, but the memory seemed distant, blurred. The figure's eyes glowed with an eerie light, and Mark could see it now, its twisted smile, the mocking glint in its gaze. "You've always been afraid, Mark," the figure continued, its voice dripping with disdain. "Afraid of the truth, afraid of facing your guilt, your sins. And now, you think you can walk through this place as if you have the right to redeem yourself. You are not worthy of redemption." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his throat, and he stumbled back, as if the force of the figure's words had knocked the wind out of him. He had fought so hard, but now the darkness seemed to be closing in once again, swallowing him whole. He had been trying to prove that he was worthy of redemption, but now it felt like the world had turned on him, like he had been fooling himself all along. The figure reached out a hand toward him, and Mark could feel the cold of its touch, even from a distance. "You cannot escape the truth," it whispered, the words sliding under his skin. "You will never escape it." Mark's mind reeled. Was this the end? Was this where his journey would end, swallowed by the very darkness he had tried to escape? The figure's hand loomed closer, its presence growing heavier by the second. Mark's body tensed, his legs shaking with the sudden weight of the moment. He wanted to pull away, to run, but the weight of the words, of the judgment, seemed to hold him in place, frozen to the spot. "You're nothing," the figure spat, its voice dripping with contempt. "A failure. A liar. A coward." Mark wanted to shout back, to fight, to argue, but he couldn't find the words. The darkness around him felt suffocating, its cold grip tightening around his chest. Every breath was labored, every movement slow and heavy, as though the very air itself was trying to drag him down. "You think you can be forgiven?" the figure continued, its voice a constant echo in his mind. "You think you deserve redemption? What makes you so special?" Mark's vision blurred as the pressure in his chest intensified. He couldn't breathe. The weight of the figure's presence was more than just physical. It was like a living force, pressing against every part of him, reminding him of every mistake, every betrayal, every failure. He had tried so hard to prove that he was worthy, but now, in this moment, everything seemed to crumble beneath him. "Enough," Mark gasped, his voice hoarse, but his words were drowned out by the figure's mocking laughter. The sound reverberated in his skull, rattling him to his core. He could feel his mind spiraling, each insult, each accusation sinking deeper into his soul. "You are nothing," the figure repeated, its voice a low growl now, dripping with venom. "And when you're gone, you will be forgotten. No one will remember you. No one will care." Mark's hands clenched into fists, his nails biting into his palms as the pressure in his chest continued to build. He couldn't think straight. The figure's words were like daggers, each one sinking deeper, tearing at his resolve. What was he supposed to do? How could he move forward when everything he had ever believed was being torn apart, piece by piece? Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted again. Mark's feet slid, the earth giving way beneath him, and before he could react, he was falling. The air rushed past him, but it wasn't the fall that terrified him. It was the sudden silence that enveloped him, a silence so profound it felt like the entire world had stopped. The roar of the figure's voice was gone, replaced by the sound of nothing. It was deafening. The darkness around him felt infinite, as though he had fallen into a bottomless pit, a void that had no end. He had fallen before, figuratively in his life, but never like this. This wasn't just a stumble. This was a fall into oblivion. Mark reached out in desperation, his arms flailing, his mind racing for anything to hold on to. But there was nothing, just the darkness. The weight of the silence pressed in on him from all sides, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, but there was no air. There was only the cold, empty void. The light that had once beckoned him seemed so far away now, a distant memory. He couldn't remember when it had faded, but now all he could see was the darkness, the oppressive, suffocating darkness. There was no escape from it, no way to outrun it. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fall stopped. The void disappeared, and Mark found himself standing, though his legs were unsteady, his body trembling. He was back on solid ground, but everything around him had changed. The figure stood before him again, but this time, there was no mockery in its eyes. Instead, there was something else, something more unsettling. The figure didn't speak. It just watched Mark as though waiting for something. For an answer, perhaps. For Mark to say something, to make a choice. But Mark didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to respond to the weight of the silence, to the pressure of the figure's gaze. His mind raced, his thoughts scattered. What was the right thing to say? What could he possibly say in this moment that would make any difference? The figure's gaze never wavered. It just stood there watching him. The silence stretched on, and Mark felt as though he were suffocating in it, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, crushing him under its intensity. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. "Please," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible, his words barely a plea. "What do you want from me?" The figure remained silent. its presence looming over him like a shadow. Mark's hands shook at his sides, and he fought to keep his composure. He had already been through so much. Was this really the end? Was this where it all ended, in this endless silence, with the figure's cold, judgmental eyes watching him? The air around him seemed to hum with anticipation, the tension so thick it was palpable. The figure's eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, seemed to bore into his soul, searching for something. What was it looking for? What did it want from him? Was this some kind of test? Was he supposed to do something? The figure finally spoke, its voice soft, but filled with an undeniable weight. "You have not yet learned, Mark," it said, its words settling like a heavy stone on his chest. "You have not yet faced the truth of what you've done." Mark's heart sank as the weight of the words hit him. He had been trying so hard, trying to prove that he could move past his mistakes, that he could find redemption. But the figure was right. He hadn't faced the truth. Not completely. There was still something he hadn't done. Something he hadn't realized. The figure's gaze never left him, unblinking and unyielding. Mark felt trapped, cornered in this strange, unrelenting world, where there was no escape and no way out. The walls were closing in, and the figure's words echoed in his mind, louder than ever. "You still don't get it, do you?" the figure continued, its tone soft but filled with menace. "You think you can run from the truth. You think you can hide. But you can't. You must face what you've done, Mark. Only then can you move forward." Mark shook his head, his mind a blur. He didn't know what to do, how to make things right. The darkness was still there, still clinging to him, and the weight of his past continued to suffocate him. And in that moment, Mark realized that he wasn't going to find the answers here. He wasn't going to be able to escape the consequences of his actions, no matter how much he wished for it. The darkness wasn't going to release him. Not yet.